Kicking things off at number 1, the Pulse Nightclub. A guy named Omar Mateen walked in right after last call, blending right in with the late-night crowd before showing his true colors. Omar Mateen was born in New York in 1986 to Afghan immigrant parents and was raised down in Florida. As a kid, he was known for being moody and having a really short fuse. His teachers noticed he had an aggressive streak early on, and his classmates remembered him blowing up or making some seriously messed up comments. As he got older, that anger never really went away. He gave a criminal justice program at a community college a try but dropped out. He spent years working as a security guard, bouncing from one gig to the next, with coworkers constantly complaining about his hostile attitude, his bigotry, and his generally erratic behavior. Mateen got married twice, and both of those relationships were basically dumpster fires. His first wife would later describe him as a controlling and abusive man, given to unpredictable bursts of fury. Following their divorce, he remarried, creating what appeared to be a stable, albeit distant, life with his second wife, who later admitted she had seen red flags but felt powerless to act. In the following years, he developed a fascination with extremist ideologies, consuming violent online content and openly admiring terrorists abroad. This behavior led the FBI to interview him on 2 separate occasions. First, after he made alarming remarks about extremism, and a second time regarding potential ties to a former acquaintance linked to terrorism. In both instances, the investigations were closed after agents concluded he posed no immediate threat, with no direct evidence of criminal planning found. He was then able to legally purchase firearms and ammunition in the weeks just before the attack. His demeanor at the gun store raised no alarms, and he passed all background checks effortlessly. At the same time, he was visiting the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando multiple times, likely casing the venue ahead of his planned assault. The club was a well-known safe haven and popular hub for the LGBTQ+ community, particularly during its Latin-themed nights. Just after 2 in the morning on June 12, 2016, Mateen walked in, armed with a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. Seconds later, he began shooting into the packed crowd. The music kept playing, masking the initial sounds of gunfire as clubgoers struggled to understand the noise, realizing the horrifying truth only when it was too late. A wave of panic crashed through the venue, with patrons desperately scrambling for emergency exits, bathrooms, and back corridors. Many hid wherever they could, trapped inside as the sound of gunshots reverberated through the club. In a matter of seconds, the atmosphere of celebration turned into a fight for survival. Mateen stalked through the main room, methodically shooting at anyone he saw. Survivors would later recall the sound of shattering glass, the sight of bodies falling, and screams being swallowed by the relentless gunfire. Police responded swiftly, engaging Mateen in a firefight from outside, which pushed him further into the nightclub's interior. He fell back into a bathroom where dozens of terrified patrons were hiding. There, he took the survivors hostage as officers established a perimeter and tried to open a line of communication. During the standoff, Mateen called 911 to pledge his allegiance to extremist groups, although investigators would later determine his ideological claims were contradictory and self-serving, not part of a coordinated plot. Hostage negotiators made contact with him several times, attempting to gather intelligence and prevent any more violence. For hours, the wounded lay trapped on the floor, some desperately texting loved ones and emergency services for help. At around 5 a.m., after hearing more shots from inside and fearing an imminent execution of hostages, SWAT officers breached the building, ramming an armored vehicle through a wall and using explosives to disorient him. A final, intense gunfight erupted, and officers neutralized him in the exchange. Once inside, the true scale of the massacre became devastatingly clear. 49 people had been murdered, and more than 50 others were wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time. First responders worked tirelessly through the early morning hours, rushing survivors to hospitals and helping frantic families search for their loved ones. As news of the tragedy spread, spontaneous vigils began to form across Orlando and the nation. The crime scene itself was a sprawling, chaotic landscape of multiple rooms and exits, littered with personal belongings and shattered furniture, while investigators combed through Mateen's home, devices, and records. They uncovered no evidence of any accomplices or direction from foreign terrorist organizations, concluding he had acted alone, driven by a toxic mix of personal rage, extremist rhetoric, and a thirst for notoriety. Mateen himself was killed in the shootout. While Mateen would never face a trial, his actions triggered legal proceedings against his wife, who was charged with aiding the attack and obstruction of justice. Following a lengthy trial, she was ultimately acquitted after jurors decided prosecutors failed to prove she had prior knowledge of his plan or had assisted him. The focus then pivoted to broader questions of accountability. particularly how an individual with Mattin's history and prior contact with the FBI was still able to legally arm himself. The attack's aftermath fundamentally reshaped national conversations surrounding hate crimes, gun control, and tactical responses to active shooter events. Pulse Nightclub was transformed into a memorial, with plans developed to preserve a portion of the building as a permanent place of remembrance. The names of the victims were read aloud at solemn public ceremonies, and powerful murals appeared across Orlando to honor those who were lost. In response, advocacy groups intensified their calls for stronger gun legislation and improved tracking of domestic threats, along with increased support for the communities devastated by the violence. Investigators ultimately determined that Mattin's motives were complex, a combination of personal humiliation and an obsessive ideological fixation, fused with a deep-seated frustration he had harbored for years. His rampage left a wake of grieving families, physically and emotionally scarred survivors, and a city forced to reckon with the tragic consequences of overlooked red flags. The Pulse Nightclub shooting became an enduring symbol of both resilience and remembrance, with annual ceremonies held to honor the victims. Even today, the attack is a critical reference point in discussions about prevention strategies and law enforcement coordination and the catastrophic impact a single individual can inflict in just a few minutes. There was number 2, Parkland, Stoneman Douglas, starring Nicholas Cruz. He was the ex-student nobody saw coming back, at least, not armed to the teeth. Nicholas Cruz used to be just another face in the halls of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, known mostly for being a troubled kid with a laundry list of behavioral problems. Born in 1998 and adopted as a baby, he grew up with parents who were basically in damage control mode, trying to handle his meltdowns and emotional chaos. His adoptive dad passed away when he was a kid, leaving his mom to deal with his escalating aggression and zero impulse control. Get this. Teachers and school officials had a paper trail a mile long on this guy, years of disturbing behavior, fights, threats, a creepy obsession with weapons, and a rap sheet of disciplinary issues. So, the school's brilliant solution was to finally boot him out and stick him in an alternative program after he broke one too many rules. But even with all that paperwork screaming problem, nobody put any real, long-term brakes on him that would have stopped him from legally buying guns the second he was old enough. After his mom died out of the blue in November 2017, he bounced over to some friend's place, and then shacked up with a schoolmate's family, who had a few ground rules. It was right around then that he casually went out and bought himself an AR-15 style rifle and a bunch of ammo, which, definitely raised an eyebrow or two for anyone who knew his history. A few folks even flagged his social media, where he was basically announcing his plans to shoot up a place, but the warnings were all over the map and never amounted to anything. Cops and school officials had chatted with him more than once before the big day, yet somehow, none of those little talks stopped the train from leaving the station. On February 14th, 2018 Valentine's Day, of all days, Cruz called an Uber to his old high school. He was lugging a duffel bag and a rifle case, but apparently that didn't ring any alarm bells as he strolled into the building right before the final bell. Once he was in, he put his toy together and pulled the fire alarm to get everyone to flood the hallways. And as the halls packed with people, he started opening fire point blank, working his way through the first and second floors of Building 12. Kids were diving for cover, hiding out in classrooms, closets, or behind their desks. Some teachers became human shields, while others barricaded doors and killed the lights. A bunch of students were filming the whole nightmare on their phones while shots rang out. The 911 lines lit up, and within minutes, cops from the city and the county sheriff's office were on the scene. But in a classic case of who's on first, confusion about where he actually was slowed them down. Meanwhile, Cruz just kept strolling through the building, picking targets, until he decided he was done, ditched his rifle, and just melted into the crowd of terrified kids running out. He just walked off school property and wandered into a neighborhood nearby. Then, get this, he pops into a Subway to grab a drink, and after that, hits up a McDonald's. Just chilling among people who had no clue what he'd just done. It took the cops about an hour to finally track him down and cuff him, and he didn't even put up a fight. The final score for the day, 17 people dead. That's 14 students and 3 staff members, with another 17 injured. The sheer body count left the whole country speechless, especially since it all went down in the middle of the day at a big suburban school that had supposedly just beefed up its security. It didn't take long after his arrest for Nicholas Cruz to admit he did the whole thing. Big shocker. Investigators dug up a treasure trove of online messages, videos, and journal entries showing he was a huge fan of other mass shootings and really wanted to cause a major scene. He flat out said he wanted to make people scared and get his name in the headlines. The court case, of course, was a long, drawn-out media spectacle. The prosecutors went for the jugular, announcing they wanted the death penalty. pointing to the high body count and the fact that he'd planned the whole thing out. His defense team played the only card they had, arguing he was a mess of emotional and developmental problems, behavioral disorders, and had never gotten proper help. Then, in 2021, Cruz switched gears and pleaded guilty to everything. We're talking 17 counts of murder and another 17 of attempted murder. From there, the case moved on to the penalty phase, where the big question was whether he'd get the needle or just a permanent stay in a concrete box. The whole legal circus involved some incredibly emotional testimony from survivors, teachers, and the victims' family members. Meanwhile, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence of his planning, along with statements he'd made beforehand, and the sheer scale of the devastation. The defense's strategy was to focus on his messed up childhood, his mental health issues, and his mother's death, basically painting him as a broken toy long before the attack ever happened. After weeks of all this, the jury couldn't come to a unanimous vote for the death penalty. Because of that, the judge sentenced him to life in prison with zero chance of parole in late 2022. As you can imagine, many families were furious and deeply disappointed with that outcome, feeling that the absolute horror of the crime demanded the ultimate punishment. Nicholas Cruz is now locked away in a maximum security facility, set to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The fallout from what he did, however, went way beyond his prison sentence. Students who made it out alive became incredibly powerful advocates for change, leading nationwide protests and campaigns to overhaul firearm laws and emergency procedures in schools. The whole disaster triggered investigations into the police response, school security protocols, and mental health services. Florida lawmakers actually passed new measures, including a red flag law, which allows for the temporary confiscation of firearms from people who are deemed a threat. The name Parkland itself became synonymous with activism, grief, and the demand for accountability. The families of the victims kept fighting for reforms, meeting with politicians, and sharing their heartbreaking stories in public. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School beefed up its security and counseling services, and the building where the shooting happened was scheduled for demolition. The emotional scars from that day are still very real for everyone who was in that school and for the entire community that had to watch the aftermath. Nicholas Cruz's journey from a troubled kid to a convicted mass murderer laid bare some massive failures in our prevention, reporting, and support systems. His rampage forced a national conversation about school safety, the duties of our institutions, and all the warning signs that are so often ignored until it's way too late. Today, people remember not just the horrific violence he committed, but the powerful voices of the survivors and families who transformed their pain into a movement for change. Now for number 3, Westside Middle School, Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson. We're talking 11 and 13 years old here, an age where you'd think the worst they could plan was some typical childhood trouble. But no, Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson managed to turn their Arkansas school into the stage for a meticulously planned attack that left the country speechless. Mitchell, the 13-year-old, was already starting to show the classic signs of anger and defiance. He'd apparently talked about wanting to hurt people and made threats that his classmates just wrote off as empty talk. Andrew, though only 11, was described as the quiet type, but with an unsettling comfort level around guns. It turns out he came from a family with quite the arsenal, and he'd learned to shoot when he was little. The two of them bonded over a shared sense of resentment and a morbid fascination with violence. In the months leading up to it, they would talk about doing something that would make everyone remember their names. They started by lifting weapons from Andrew's grandfather, helping themselves to rifles, handguns, and a whole lot of ammunition. They also grabbed camping gear and supplies, which shows they were already thinking about what came after the main event. Friends later said the boys bragged that something big was about to go down, but nobody took two kids that young seriously. Of course, there were the usual warning signs at school. Some arguments, threats, and some pretty disturbing comments. But because of their age, nobody really took them seriously. Then, on March 24th, 1998, the boys decided to show they meant business. That morning, they loaded up the weapons and supplies they'd swiped into Mitchell's mom's van and headed over to Westside Middle School in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Once they got there, Andrew casually walked inside the school and pulled the fire alarm. As all the students and teachers started pouring out, thinking it was just another routine drill, the two of them got into position in a wooded area with a perfect view of the schoolyard. From that sweet spot, they opened fire on their own classmates and teachers as they were all filing out in neat little lines. The whole ambush was over in just a few minutes, but for the people scrambling to get away from the bullets, it felt like an eternity. It was pure chaos, with kids running in every direction trying to find cover, with no clue where the shots were even coming from. Teachers were desperately trying to shield students or herd them back into the building. The emergency calls went out instantly, but by the time the cops showed up, the whole thing was over. The boys had already dropped their weapons and tried to take off on foot, but the police nabbed them not too far away. You can bet the investigators were floored when they saw how old the suspects were. The level of absolute mayhem just didn't compute with the sight of these little kids standing there in handcuffs. The final tally was 5 people dead, 4 students, and 1 teacher, and 10 others were injured. The victims were just caught in the middle of the evacuation, confusion, totally unaware they were walking right into a trap. In the aftermath, the small town of Jonesboro was just completely shell-shocked. Families rushed to hospitals and meetup points, just praying their children were okay. The crime scene was massive, stretching from the schoolyard all the way to the woods where the boys had been waiting. The authorities found multiple weapons, a ton of ammo, and even bags packed with food and clothes, which made it pretty clear they had a whole escape plan to survive on the run after the attack. Now, because they were so young, the legal system's hands were tied. At the time, Arkansas law wouldn't let you try minors as young as Mitchell and Andrew as adults for murder. So, they were both charged as juveniles, and the absolute longest sentence they could get was being locked up until they turned 21. They were found guilty of killing and injuring their classmates and teacher, and they got shipped off to 2 different juvenile detention centers. And as you can guess, those ridiculously short sentences made a lot of people in the town and across the country furious. It kicked off a massive debate about the laws for young offenders who pull off mass attacks. Some politicians started trying to change the sentencing rules so that kids who commit serious crimes could be put away for longer. As their release dates got closer, people started getting pretty nervous about what would happen when they got out. Mitchell Johnson was released in 2005 at the ripe old age of 21, and Andrew Golden got out 2 years later when he hit the same age. And get this, neither one could be monitored the way a regular adult felon would be, and their juvenile records were totally sealed. Years later, Johnson would get himself into more legal trouble for gun possession and drug charges, which just goes to show that his violent little episode at 13 probably wasn't just a one-time thing. Golden, on the other hand, lived a quiet life under a new name until he died in a car accident in 2019. The Westside Middle School shooting became one of the first and most shocking cases of a mass attack carried out by kids in the United States. It forced a bunch of states to change their juvenile justice laws and made schools everywhere rethink their lockdown procedures and how they respond to alarms. The whole fire alarm trick showed a chillingly smart understanding of how the school worked in an emergency. And you better believe educational institutions all over the country took notes. For the families of the victims, those scars never really healed. They built memorials to honor the ones who were lost, and survivors have talked about the long-term damage nightmares, anxiety, and just losing that feeling of safety on what should have been a totally ordinary school day. The whole thing also kicked off some serious conversations about how easily kids can get their hands on guns in their own homes. Andrew had no problem getting to his family's guns, and Mitchell didn't have any trouble helping him move them. Their age didn't stop them for a second from planning, stealing, and carrying out their attack with a level of precision that's just unheard of for kids that age. Even decades later, the case is still infamous for that bizarre combination of youth, meticulous planning, and sheer lethality. The story of Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson is a stark reminder that real danger can pop up in places you'd never even think to look. Their actions changed laws, completely rewrote safety protocols, and left behind a legacy of pain that still hangs over the community they attacked. Which brings us to number 4, the Aurora Theater, starring James Holmes. He waltzed into the midnight premiere looking like any other movie fan, but what he brought with him would turn a night of fun into one of the most awful tragedies in recent American history. James Holmes grew up in California and was described by most people who knew him as quiet, super smart, and socially awkward. Born in 1987, he crushed it academically and got into neuroscience at an early age. After graduating with honors from the University of California, Riverside, he got into a highly competitive neuroscience PhD program at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora. But as the schoolwork got tougher, his mind started to seriously unravel. His classmates and professors started to notice some changes. He became withdrawn, stopped pitching in on group projects, and was really struggling to keep up with his classes. By the spring of 2012, his grades had tanked, and he completely bombed a huge oral exam, which led him to just drop out of the program. Behind the curtain, Holmes was dealing with some major mental health issues. In March of 2012, he started seeing a campus psychiatrist and briefly mentioned having violent thoughts and fantasies. The psychiatrist raised these concerns with the university's threat assessment team, but because he was already leaving the school and hadn't made any direct threats, they basically did nothing. Right around that same time, he went on a perfectly legal shopping spree, buying multiple firearms from local gun shops, a shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and a handgun. He also bought thousands of rounds of ammunition and ordered tactical gear online, including a helmet, a vest, and a gas mask. His neighbors saw boxes getting delivered to his apartment all the time, but had no clue what he was planning. While he was prepping for the attack, he booby-trapped his apartment with homemade explosives and tripwires, designed to blow up if someone opened the door. On July 19, 2012, he mailed a notebook filled with his violent writings to his former psychiatrist, but it wasn't even opened until after the whole nightmare had already happened. The very next night, July 20th, he drove to the Century 16 movie theater in Aurora, where hundreds of people were packed in for the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. He bought a ticket, went into the theater, and sat in the front row for a few minutes before ducking out through an emergency exit he had propped open. A little after 12 a.m., he came back through that same side door, decked out in body armor and carrying his weapons. Without a single word, he tossed gas canisters into the crowd. As smoke filled the air, the moviegoers thought it was just some kind of cheap gimmick for the film. Moments later, he started firing into the audience, moving slowly and methodically, targeting anyone he could. Pure panic exploded as people scrambled behind seats, crawled down the aisles, or tried to run for the stairs. Some managed to escape through the emergency exits, while others were just trapped in the absolute chaos and confusion. Within a few minutes, dozens of people had been shot. Outside, the 911 lines were completely flooded with calls, and cops from multiple agencies were speeding to the scene. Cops showed up within minutes, walking right into a nightmare scene of wounded people scrambling out of the building and others who weren't moving at all. Out in the parking lot, they found James Holmes just standing near his car, like he was waiting for them. He didn't put up a fight when they walked up, and he told them exactly who he was right away. Of course, he was decked out in tactical gear with more weapons sitting in the vehicle. Right there on the scene, he casually warned the officers that his apartment was wired to blow. So, the bomb squad had to go deal with that little surprise before anyone could set foot inside. Meanwhile, back in the theater, the final count was 12 people dead and another 70 shot up, and a whole lot of them were in critical condition. Survivors told stories that sounded straight out of a horror movie. Pure chaos and terror, tripping over bodies, sliding in blood, and just the endless sound of gunfire in the pitch dark. First responders had to set up makeshift emergency rooms right outside the theater, even using police cars as ambulances because the real ones were completely swamped. And just like that, the attack earned its place as one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at the time. The news, of course, blew up nationwide, and by sunrise, the grim process of naming the victims and survivors had begun. James Holmes was officially in custody and eventually got slapped with a staggering 166 counts, covering everything from murder to attempted murder. His lawyers went for the Hail Mary, the insanity defense. They argued his brain was so scrambled he couldn't tell reality from fantasy or control himself. The prosecutors, however, weren't buying it, pointing out that the guy's meticulous planning showed he knew exactly what he was doing. They laid it all out: the gun shopping spree, the ridiculously over-the-top booby-trapped apartment, and the perfectly timed attack, all Exhibit A for a man with a plan. For months, the courtroom was packed with survivors and victims' families, and you can bet they were all there for one reason: to see him get the harshest sentence imaginable. The trial basically turned into a battle of the shrinks. Two court-appointed experts looked at Holmes and said, "Sure, he's mentally ill, but not get-out-of-jail-free insane." Meanwhile, the prosecution walked the jury through the attack, step by horrifying step, showing all the receipts for his preparations and laying bare the devastating ripple effect on the victims. Family members got up and gave heartbreaking statements about the lives that were just erased, the permanent injuries, and the kind of trauma that sticks with you forever. The defense, on the other hand, painted a picture of his slow-motion train wreck of a life, his fizzled-out academic journey, and all the giant red flags that everyone apparently missed. After a trial that dragged on for months in 2015, the jury came back and found Holmes guilty on every single charge. When it came time for sentencing, the prosecutors went for the death penalty, but for that, they needed everyone on the jury to agree. In the end, there was at least one holdout who just wouldn't sign off on it, so the court handed him the next best thing: life in prison with zero chance of ever getting out. They shipped him off to a high-security facility where he's watched like a hawk. Some of the victims' families were, understandably, pretty ticked off about him dodging the death penalty, while others felt like letting him rot in a cell for the rest of his life was justice enough. And then came the inevitable aftermath. A whole lot of talk about fixing background checks, mental health systems, emergency response, and why a movie theater needs to be a fortress. The theater itself eventually reopened after a major facelift, but the actual auditorium, where it all went down, was shut for good and completely redesigned. Memorials popped up to remember the people who were killed, and a bunch of scholarships and charities were started in their honor. But for the survivors, the story didn't end there. They were looking at years of recovery, more surgeries, and emotional scars that don't just disappear when the news cycle moves on. To this day, James Holmes has never given a straight answer for why he did it, leaving his motive as a big, fat question mark for everyone to guess at. Investigators' best theory is a toxic cocktail of loneliness and an untreated mental illness mixed with academic failure and a sick obsession with becoming infamous. The one thing we know for sure is that his little stunt completely changed the way people think about feeling safe in public and how institutions are supposed to deal with people who are spiraling. What happened that night in Aurora left behind a legacy of grief, a bunch of attempts at legal reform, and the nagging question of how he was never stopped. And coming in at number 5, Robb Elementary School, Salvador Ramos. He spent nearly all his time alone, a ghost drifting between online forums and the silence of his own bedroom, practically invisible to the world around him. Salvador Ramos was just a teenager from Uvalde, Texas, whose blank expression concealed a simmering rage and a profound disconnect. Born in 2004, his home life was a wreck, filled with family drama and constant fighting. Old classmates remembered him as the kid who got picked on for his clothes, the way he talked, and just for being awkward. By high school, he was barely showing up to class and eventually just quit going. He cut himself off from friends, family, and anyone he used to know, with zero interest in graduating or getting a job. People who knew him said he was a young man who seemed immune to shame and was being swallowed whole by his own loneliness. In the months before his rampage, his focus narrowed to one thing: guns. Right after his 18th birthday in May of 2022, he walked into a local gun shop and legally bought 2 rifles and a pile of ammo. He even posted pictures of his new arsenal on social media, but never made a direct enough threat to set off any alarms. Around that same time, he was having some seriously twisted chats with people online, dropping hints about violence but keeping it vague. His family just saw a moody kid, figuring he was just frustrated or down in the dumps. But in his private messages, a dark obsession with past mass shootings and a deep-seated resentment were becoming clear. None of it ever got reported to the police before it was too late. On the morning of May 24th, 2022, he got into a fight with the grandmother he was living with. It blew up into something she never could have seen coming. He grabbed one of those rifles and shot her right there in their home. She was critically hurt, but somehow found the strength to call for help, and amazingly, she survived. Salvador grabbed her truck keys and sped off toward Robb Elementary School, just a couple of minutes down the road. As he got close, he lost control and crashed the truck in a ditch near the school grounds. People saw him climb out, armed to the teeth and dressed in black. He started firing at people outside before making his way to the building. It was just before 11 in the morning. Robb Elementary had a security plan, locked doors and emergency drills, but it turned out one of the doors he walked up to hadn't latched correctly. He strolled right in through that entrance and found himself in a hallway. The moment he was inside, the sound of gunfire ripped through the corridors, and teachers and kids began scrambling for their lives. Some teachers were able to lock their doors in time, which funneled him toward the rooms that were still vulnerable. He found 2 adjoining classrooms, connected by an internal door, and went inside and started shooting, leaving a room full of students and teachers with absolutely nowhere to run. The 911 calls started pouring in, frantic reports of a shooter in the school and children in grave danger. Law enforcement showed up within minutes, local cops, school district police, and eventually, state and federal agents. But what happened next was a catastrophic failure. Total confusion about who was in charge and a complete misread of the situation led to unforgivable delays. Cops piled up in the hallway but failed to breach the classroom doors where the slaughter was happening. The official reports and radio chatter from that day paint a pretty grim picture. A whole lot of hesitation, garbled communication, and the boneheaded assumption that this was a barricaded suspect, not a guy actively hunting kids. And all the while, kids trapped inside were still calling 911, whispering for someone to please come help, begging as the minutes ticked by like hours. It took a staggering 77 minutes from when Salvador walked in to when law enforcement finally broke down that classroom door. Eventually, a tactical team showed up, made their way down the hall, and finally confronted him. He was taken down right there on the scene by officers, but the damage was done, and it was devastating. 19 kids and 2 teachers were gone, with many more hurt. The school, the whole town, was just paralyzed in shock as parents desperately waited for news about their children. Medical teams and first responders were thrown into the chaos, trying to manage the scene, rushing survivors to hospitals, and scrambling to set up zones for families to come together. In the hours and days that followed, the national media descended on the town. Reporters swarmed in from all over the country, and public officials suddenly found themselves under a white-hot spotlight. The stories that came out from parents, witnesses, and even some officers painted a gut-wrenching picture of heartbreak and pure fury over how long it took for anyone to act. Naturally, investigations kicked off at the local, state, and federal levels, all trying to answer the big questions. How did he just walk in? Why did all the safety plans completely fall apart? And why in the world did officers wait so long? Authorities dug into everything they could find on him. His online life, his family background, his mental state. What they found was not much. No criminal record to speak of. No official mental health diagnosis in the system, and zero protective orders that would have stopped him from buying those weapons. And yet, beneath the surface, they saw clear patterns of aggression, deep isolation, and a fascination with violence that everyone apparently missed or ignored. Since he was killed right there, Salvador Ramos never saw the inside of a courtroom. So, the legal battle pivoted. It became all about holding the police accountable, questioning school security, and taking a hard look at gun laws. The victims' families started demanding answers and screaming for reform. Some took it a step further, filing lawsuits against the agencies and companies involved, accusing them of negligence and a total failure to protect their kids. State lawmakers started pushing new bills for overhauling emergency response, tightening background checks, and beefing up campus safety. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice launched its own review to pick apart every decision the officers made and figure out how to stop something like this from ever happening again. For months after the attack, Robb Elementary School stayed shut, its doors locked. Eventually, plans were announced to tear the whole building down. The community agreed that no one should ever have to walk those halls again. All around the school and across town, memorials started popping up, honoring every single victim with photos, crosses, and heartfelt messages that poured in from all over the globe. The parents and families of those kids began to speak out publicly about their grief, channeling that unimaginable pain into a powerful push for change. The whole tragedy threw gasoline on the fire of national debates about gun laws, funding for school security, and mental health support for young people. Police departments all over the country started tearing apart their own rulebooks, trying to make sure they could intervene way faster next time. To this day, the story of Salvador Ramos and Robb Elementary comes up anytime school safety is on the table in America. It laid bare the massive gaps in emergency training, the total breakdown in communication, and just how ridiculously easy it is to get certain types of weapons. People who used to just see him as some quiet, troubled kid now hear his name and think of one of the deadliest school massacres in Texas history. And even though investigators managed to retrace his every step, they could never really get inside his head to understand the why behind it all. The Uvalde community is still mourning, still trying to rebuild, forever changed by a day that started out normal and ended as a national wake-up call about safety, accountability, and prevention. Number 6, Cleveland Elementary School. So, let's talk about Patrick Purdy. He just rolled up to a schoolyard on a perfectly nice January morning, looking like he belonged there for just a second. And then, he made sure nothing would ever be the same. Patrick Purdy was your textbook drifter with a rap sheet full of instability, petty arrests, and a massive chip on his shoulder against the world. Born back in 1964, he had a rough go of it growing up in a messed up home in California, which was basically a tour of frequent moves, an abusive dad, and a childhood spent getting passed between relatives and foster homes. Surprise, surprise, he grew up to struggle with drugs and holding down a job. People who knew him as an adult pretty much all said the same thing. He was angry, lost, and completely hung up on the idea that the world had screwed him over. His list of arrests included the usual suspects, possession charges, vandalism, and, you guessed it, weapons violations. And every single time, he just slipped right through the cracks of the system with no real supervision or help. By the late 1980s, Purdy had found a new hobby, blaming all his personal failures on immigrants and minorities. He bounced around boarding homes and worked whatever dead-end jobs he could manage to keep for more than a week. Then, in the months right before the attack, he went out and legally bought himself some firearms, including a semi-automatic rifle. Mind you, despite his criminal record and the fact that he was clearly going off the deep end. The background check system back then was a joke and completely failed to flag the sale. He also tinkered with the weapon to make it even deadlier, because of course he did. People who ran into him said he was always muttering to himself and seemed to be drifting further and further away from planet Earth. Then, on January 17, 1989, Patrick Purdy drove his car to Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California. It's worth noting the school had a huge number of kids from Cambodian and Vietnamese refugee families, individuals who had escaped a war zone only to resettle in the area with their families. Purdy, in a classic opening move, parked his car behind the building and torched it with a gasoline-filled container, presumably to stir up some confusion or just block the exits. He then casually strolled onto the school playground, armed with a semi-automatic rifle and plenty of extra ammo. And just like that, with no warning, he started shooting into a crowd of young students enjoying their morning break. Observers later noted he seemed chillingly deliberate and void of emotion, aiming right into the cluster of kids as they screamed and scattered. Teachers and staff, in a heroic but tragically familiar script, scrambled to drag students into classrooms. Some used their own bodies as shields, while others frantically locked doors and called for help. Within minutes, the 911 calls painted a grim picture. Dozens of wounded kids, and total chaos on school grounds. Purdy kept firing until his weapon predictably jammed, and he noticed the cops were closing in. He then took the easy way out right there on the scene with a handgun he'd brought along. The whole bloody affair was over in just a couple of minutes, but it left a scar that would be felt nationwide. 5 children were dead, every last one of them between 6 and 9 years old, and about 30 others were wounded, mostly from the gunfire. The victims, of course, were mainly kids from Southeast Asian refugee families. Survivors talked about the sheer terror and confusion of seeing their friends just drop next to them. Police and paramedics swarmed the scene, rushing the injured children to local hospitals. Parents started showing up at the school in a frantic search for their sons and daughters. Some got lucky, while others were handed the worst news imaginable. Digging into Patrick Purdy's life revealed the usual cocktail of neglect, bigotry, and mental instability. He had a well-documented hatred for immigrants, blamed them for, you guessed it, taking jobs and resources. Inside his car and rented room, authorities found the standard racist manifestos and other items confirming his violent worldview. His activities in the weeks leading up to the attack showed he'd picked the school specifically for its large population of immigrant children. He had zero personal connection to any of the victims or staff, which only made the whole thing feel even more pointlessly cruel to the community. Since he checked out at the scene, there was no trial, no sentencing. The legal and political circus instead shifted its focus to how he got the weapon and which laws needed a rewrite. California lawmakers jumped into action, passing new rules on semi-automatic rifles and magazine sizes. The whole incident became a major talking point in the national debate on gun control through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Advocacy groups and the victims' families predictably pushed for tougher background checks and mental health screenings for anyone trying to buy a firearm. The federal government later pointed to the attack as a textbook case when they were drafting even bigger legislation. Meanwhile, Cleveland Elementary School was left to figure out how to even begin moving on. Counseling was brought in for students and staff, a great many of whom were saddled with long-term trauma. The playground, the scene of the crime, was eventually redone, and memorials were put up for the children who were killed. The community rallied to support the families, many of whom had already survived war and being displaced, only to have their new safe haven turn into a nightmare. For years after, the Stockton shooting became the go-to reference anytime school safety came up in America. It was a brutal lesson in how fast one guy with a powerful weapon could tear a community to shreds. Experts and politicians started pushing for threat assessment programs, more firearm restrictions, and better ways to intervene with people showing violent tendencies. While its name would eventually be eclipsed by later tragedies, the Cleveland Elementary attack was a real turning point in how schools and cops started preparing for mass shootings. Patrick Purdy never gave any courtroom testimony, never faced a cross-examination. His rampage was fueled by a toxic mix of hate, instability, and a pathetic need to blame his own failures on someone else. The tragedy he unleashed continues to live in the memories of the survivors and the families of the kids who never made it home. His name is now forever linked to a moment in history that raised ugly questions about who gets a weapon, what warning signs get ignored, and just how vulnerable our kids are in the places they should be safest. On to number 7, Columbine High School, starring Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. You'd see them in the hallways and think nothing of it, just a couple of high school kids. But behind closed doors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were cooking up a little something that would rock the entire nation. Both were seniors at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. On the surface, they were your classic quiet outcasts, not exactly prom kings, but not totally invisible either. Eric, for his part, had some well-documented issues with anger and control, while Dylan was battling depression and feeling more and more disconnected from everything. Back in 1998, the pair got busted for breaking into a van and were sentenced to a juvenile diversion program. They finished the program, looked like they'd learned their lesson, and went on their way. But behind the scenes, their resentment was just stewing. During their senior year, you could see these little hints that their hostility was dialing up. They started making these home movies together, basically just ranting about their classmates and the world at large. Their journals were packed with rage, revenge fantasies, and a creepy admiration for guys who'd pulled off attacks before them. They were also documenting the baby steps of what would turn into a meticulously calculated plan for mass violence. They started getting their hands on guns through private sellers and friends, neatly sidestepping the background checks that would have red flagged them for being underage. And just for good measure, they started collecting materials for homemade bombs. See, their goal wasn't just a shooting spree. They wanted to blow every previous incident out of the water in terms of scale and impact. So, on the morning of April 20th, 1999, they showed up at Columbine rocking long trench coats to hide their arsenal. They were armed with shotguns, a carbine rifle, and a TEC-9 style pistol. They dropped duffel bags packed with propane bombs in the school cafeteria, timed to go off right in the middle of the busiest lunch rush. When the bombs fizzled, it was time for Plan B. At around 11 a.m., they started opening fire outside near the west entrance, picking off students who were just hanging out, eating their lunch. The emergency lines lit up with panic calls, and the school went into immediate lockdown, with teachers screaming for students to hit the deck. Eric and Dylan then casually strolled into the building and made their way to the library, which had become a makeshift hiding spot for dozens of students. For the next several minutes, they roamed through the room, taking shots at anyone they saw. Some students got hit while trying to take cover under tables. A few others were able to bust out through the windows to escape. Their movements seemed random, but they were chillingly deliberate, and they clearly had zero intention of giving up. In the library alone, they took out multiple students and wounded many more in just a few minutes. They also tried to engage the cops outside, trading gunfire through the windows. The sheer amount of terror and chaos inside the school made it nearly impossible for law enforcement on the outside to get a clear picture of what was happening in real time. Meanwhile, a bunch of other bombs they'd planted around the school and in their cars also failed to go off, which thankfully prevented an even bigger catastrophe. Police and SWAT teams swarmed the campus, trying to get students and staff out. Some people were trapped for hours, hiding in classrooms and closets, with no idea if the shooters were right outside the door. After nearly 50 minutes of pure mayhem, back inside the library, Eric and Dylan decided to end the show by turning their weapons on themselves. By the time the curtain fell, 12 students and 1 teacher were dead, and over 20 others were injured. The shockwave radiated far beyond the school walls. As parents and news crews gathered outside, desperate for information, many not knowing if their kids were even alive. In the following days, investigators began the grim task of tearing through their homes and computers. They uncovered the infamous videotapes the two had recorded before the attack, laying out their motives and putting their deep-seated resentment on full display. Their journals laid out months of meticulous planning, right down to the bomb strategy that, luckily, flopped. Friends and acquaintances were all brought in for questioning, and some of them admitted they'd noticed the guys were acting differently, but nobody could have predicted the sheer scale of what they had in mind. The big questions started to fly. How did they get the guns? And why were so many warning signs either ignored or completely missed? It was the perfect storm of depression, rage, and a thirst for infamy that cooked up a deadly result nobody thought was even possible back then. And since both shooters took themselves out, there was never going to be a trial. So, the legal battleground shifted over to the victims' families, school officials, the local police department, and the people who sold them the guns. Lawsuits started piling up. Committees were formed, and the national conversation around bullying, school safety, and mental health suddenly got a whole lot louder. The attack laid bare some serious flaws in emergency response plans and the way schools communicated with law enforcement. Columbine became the new blueprint for all future active shooter training and lockdown drills. And suddenly, we had school resource officers popping up all over the country. Yeah, that day was a real game changer for how schools started playing defense and how politicians began talking a big game about guns. In the years that followed, the deep dive reports came out. And surprise, surprise, it turned out Eric and Dylan had been very busy little bees. We're talking homemade bombs, detailed diaries of their angst, and they'd even circled the date on their calendar months ahead of time. Their goal was to rack up a score that was way bigger than what actually went down. Naturally, a whole alphabet soup of federal and state agencies swooped in to figure out how everyone missed the memo on these two. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were the ones actually doing something, starting foundations and scholarships to remember the people they lost. Survivors started telling their stories, pushing for prevention, mental health awareness, and, actual changes to school rules. The shadow of Columbine is long, heavy, and tangled. It basically invented the modern school security playbook across the United States and completely wrecked the idea that some places were off-limits for this kind of horror. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold checked out before anyone could put them on the stand, leaving no chance to grill them. But what they did kicked off decades of reforms, endless analysis, and a whole lot of heartbreak. To this day, just saying the name Columbine is like a gut punch. It means pain, a scramble for prevention, and a constant need to look over your shoulder. Every year, the victims are remembered by their families, friends, and the ones who made it out, making sure nobody just lets the whole thing fade into history. The story of that April morning is still a brutal lesson in how isolation, meticulous planning, and a pile of ignored red flags can cook up a tragedy you can't undo. And now for number 8, Sandy Hook Elementary. The perpetrator, Adam Lanza, was a young man who rarely spoke and consistently avoided making eye contact. He spent the majority of his time holed up in his blacked-out bedroom. To the residents of Newtown, Connecticut, Adam Lanza was simply the reserved young man living with his mom in a big house on Yogananda Street. Nobody could have foreseen that he would be behind one of the most horrific school massacres in the nation's history. His history showed clear signs of a growing, profound isolation. Born in 1992, he was known as a bright kid who was also deeply withdrawn. Throughout elementary and middle school, he found it difficult to form connections with his peers and consistently shied away from any group activities. Educators remembered him as being visibly uncomfortable with physical contact, loud noises, and chaotic environments. Following his parents' divorce in 2009, his withdrawal from the world only intensified. His father started a new family and moved out of state, leaving his mother, Nancy Lanza, as his sole companion. She took on the roles of his homeschool teacher and caregiver, attempting to manage his severe anxiety and guide him through daily life, all while he systematically severed almost every tie to the outside world. By the time he reached his late teens, he wasn't employed, wasn't enrolled in college, and had no friends coming over. His entire existence had contracted to the confines of online forums, graphic media, and his mother's collection of firearms. While Nancy was known around town as being warm and outgoing, sources close to the family revealed she was struggling to cope with Adam's escalating detachment from reality. She would take him to shooting ranges, and she legally possessed several firearms. It was later discovered by investigators that he had developed a disturbing obsession with mass casualty events, particularly those targeting schools. He would dedicate hours to collecting news clippings and meticulously researching the timelines of other cases. In the months just before December of 2012, his behavior took a turn for the worse. He ceased all verbal communication with his mother, speaking to her exclusively through notes and written messages he'd leave for her around the house. Despite this, she kept on taking care of him, completely oblivious to the horrific plan he was putting into motion. On the night of December 13th, Adam was online researching previous massacres and finalizing his own deadly blueprint. In the pre-dawn hours of December 14th, as his mother slept, Adam took a rifle and fatally shot her several times from point-blank range. She was killed in her bed, with no opportunity to defend herself. He then grabbed her car keys, loaded the vehicle with firearms, ammo, and magazines, and made his way to Sandy Hook Elementary School. He pulled up just after 9 in the morning. The school had, ironically, just upgraded its security protocols, which included keeping the front doors locked once the morning bell rang. Adam walked up to the entrance, used a rifle to blast his way through the glass panel next to the door, and was inside within seconds. The sharp crack of gunfire initially just confused the staff. Some assumed a piece of equipment had fallen or something had shattered, never suspecting an armed intruder was already stalking the hallway. As he advanced towards the classrooms, teachers screamed for their students to take cover. Some heroically pulled children into closets and bathrooms, quickly shutting off the lights and barricading the doors with whatever they could find. In a terrifying span of just a few minutes, he breached 2 separate first-grade classrooms, firing relentlessly. The 911 dispatch center was inundated with frantic calls reporting gunfire and screaming. Police units were dispatched immediately, arriving on the scene within minutes. Staff who had managed to get out pointed officers toward the classrooms under attack. As law enforcement started to close in on his position, the wail of sirens growing ever louder, Adam ducked into an empty classroom and took his own life. The entire rampage, from the moment he shot his way into the school to the final gunshot, lasted less than 11 minutes. Once the building was secured, investigators discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. 20 children and 6 adult staff members had been murdered. Many of the adults died while trying to shield their students or guide them to safety. The accounts from survivors painted a picture of pure chaos, terror, and incredible acts of bravery in the face of it. News of the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary spread like wildfire across the nation. Terrified parents raced to the school, desperately searching for their kids while police established a nearby staging area. Some were thankfully reunited with their children, collapsing in tears of relief. But for others, an agonizing weight turned into unbearable dread as authorities began to confirm the devastating number of casualties. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the nation, sparking international headlines and a massive outpouring of collective grief. Vigils were organized in states all across the country, and the names and faces of the innocent victims were shared everywhere. Meanwhile, investigators executed a search warrant on the Lanza home, seizing computers, hard drives, and personal journals. Their search revealed that Adam had obsessively studied previous mass shootings, even compiling a detailed timeline of the events. While he clearly had a fixation on violent acts, he left behind no manifesto or clear reason for choosing Sandy Hook as his target. Because he took his own life at the scene, Adam Lanza would never face charges or stand trial. The authorities' focus then shifted to the painstaking task of piecing together his motives and the sequence of events that led to the attack. The FBI, alongside the Connecticut State Police, dedicated months to meticulously analyzing a mountain of digital evidence, medical records, as well as interviews with relatives and old-school files. The final official report, which was released in late 2013, concluded that Lanza suffered from significant mental health issues, but that he had displayed no clear warning signs in the days immediately preceding the attack. His mother, who was often described as a caring and protective parent, faced posthumous criticism for allowing him access to firearms in their home, given his well-documented instability. In the aftermath, some lawmakers went through the motions, proposing new rules for weapon access, school safety, and mental health, but with no trial, there was no verdict. Still, the shockwaves from December 14, 2012, spread far beyond Newtown, igniting the same old national arguments over background checks, military-style weapons, school resource officers, and emergency planning. The victims' families, left with no other recourse, took on the gun manufacturers and any institution they felt shared the blame. Across the nation, education officials scrambled to rethink campus security and crisis drills. And while the official reports tried to piece together Adam Lanza's life, a whole lot of questions were left hanging. His own father later admitted he wished his son had never existed, a man crushed by the weight of the lives lost and the ruin his child had caused. The Lanza family vanished from the public eye as the media storm swirled around the victims. The ghost of Sandy Hook still haunts every conversation about public safety and mental health. Towns across the United States invoke its name to justify security upgrades, while survivors push for support services and ways to stop the next one. Some of the victims' families even started foundations to keep their children's memories alive and help others shattered by trauma. The school itself was torn down in 2013, replaced by a new building designed with fortress-like safety features and memorials woven into its very walls. To this day, the name Sandy Hook is a gut punch, a symbol of pain, strength, and the bitter, unsettled argument over how a young man waving so many red flags could unleash something so completely devastating. When people try to wrap their heads around Adam Lanza, they get stuck trying to connect the quiet, invisible boy with the monstrous amount of pain he caused. He didn't leave a note, a manifesto, or any kind of explanation. All investigators could find was a long, slow pattern of isolation, obsessive behavior, and a complete checkout from reality. The whole disaster brought up tough questions about how our society spots ticking time bombs, helps people who are clearly struggling, and controls who gets their hands on deadly weapons. The nightmare in Newtown dragged some ugly truths into the light, forcing policy changes and a whole lot of grief. And yet, after all the ink spilled and all the analysis, there's still no neat little answer for why it happened in that peaceful Connecticut town, or why all the warning signs were ignored until it was far too late. And then? Number 9. Virginia Tech and Seung Hui Cho. This was a guy who blended in so well he was practically invisible. Most people who walked right by him couldn't even remember his face. On paper, Seung Hui Cho was just another student at Virginia Tech. In reality, he almost never spoke in class, dodged eye contact, and kept to himself so much he was like a ghost on campus. He was born in South Korea back in 1984 and moved to the US with his family when he was a kid. While he was growing up in Virginia, his teachers noticed he had a really hard time with social situations and even just talking to people. By the time he hit middle school, he had an official diagnosis for anxiety and selective mutism, which basically meant he spent almost all of his time completely alone. But despite all those red flags, he managed to get into college and even enrolled as an English major. Once he got to the campus in Blacksburg, though, things started getting even more unsettling. Other students remembered his unnerving silence and how he flat out refused to participate in anything, but mostly they remembered the incredibly disturbing things he wrote, which were filled with violence and resentment. A few professors and classmates actually reported him, but you guessed it, nothing concrete was ever done. Throughout his time at Virginia Tech, Cho was physically present. He lived in a dorm, he went to his classes, but he never really connected with a single person. His whole vibe just screamed off he was quiet, totally detached, and if anyone tried to talk to him, it was like talking to a brick wall. Back in 2005, a special justice took one look at his psyche eval and officially stamped him mentally ill. But, in a stroke of genius, decided against inpatient treatment. Instead, they just sent him on his way with a suggestion to maybe try some outpatient care. Naturally, with zero follow-up and departments not talking to each other, he just kind of fell through the cracks. For the next 2 years, his rage and fascination with infamous gunmen kicked into high gear. He was writing scripts straight out of a horror film and recording video rants, spewing hate for society and everyone he felt screwed him over. Meanwhile, he was quietly stocking up on firearms and ammo, breezing through background checks like it was nothing, despite that little mentally ill note in his file, because thanks to a convenient loophole, his outpatient status didn't legally disqualify him. So, on the morning of April 16, 2007, Sung Hoi Cho put his quietly crafted plan into motion. Shortly after 7 a.m., he strolled into West Ambler Johnston Hall, a co-ed dorm, and shot 2 students, a female resident and a guy who just happened to cross his path. Then, he simply walked out and went back to his own room. But instead of making a run for it, he got ready for Act 2. He dropped a package in the mail for a news network, complete with his manifesto and some glamour shots, and a collection of video diaries he'd filmed in the preceding days. Roughly 2 hours later, he took a trip across campus over to Norris Hall, an academic building buzzing with morning classes, full of classrooms and engineering labs. Cho made sure to chain a few of the main doors shut from the inside, to keep everyone from leaving and to slow down the cops. He then went on a tour, room by room, opening fire on students and professors. As the sound of gunfire echoed, 911 operators were flooded with frantic calls. In some classrooms, people were desperately barricading doors with desks and lab equipment, while others were trying to leap from windows to get away from the shooting. In more than a few rooms, professors were doing their best to shield students or physically block the doorway, just to buy a few precious seconds for others to escape. The hallways became a cacophony of gunfire, screams, and the raw sounds of people trying to stay alive. By the time police showed up, they were greeted by locked and chained exterior entrances, which, just as he planned, slowed down their entry. They had to force their way inside, weapons ready, moving fast toward the sound of the shots. In one of the classrooms, they discovered Cho had ended his own life just as they were closing in. All told, he killed 32 people and wounded 17 more, cementing its place as one of the most lethal campus attacks in the history of the United States. The whole event, those 2 separate shootings, first at the dorm, then at Norris Hall, played out over about 2.5 hours, even though the second part was a brutal 11-minute blitz. A lot of the victims were just students in their morning classes, and professors died trying to block doors or shield them. The story just exploded across the country. That afternoon, Virginia Tech finally went into lockdown, and the emergency alerts started pinging on the phones of students and parents. Families started gathering near the campus, stuck in that awful limbo of waiting for news about their loved ones. And right on cue, the media circus rolled into Blacksburg, transforming the town into the center of the world's attention. The campus itself was in a state of shock, with vigils and memorials popping up in the days that followed. The whole mess immediately brought up some pretty obvious questions, like, how does a student with a documented history of mental health problems legally buy guns? And why wasn't anyone paying closer attention to all the blaring warning signs? The investigation, big surprise, uncovered a whole chain of oops moments. The court records about his mental health ruling? Yeah, they never quite made it into the national background check system. And all those faculty members worried about his creepy writing and behavior? Their concerns were noted, then promptly filed away. After the fact, authorities finally got around to opening that package he'd mailed. Inside his manifesto and videos were a bunch of rambling statements where he vented his hatred for the rich, the popular, and the privileged, trying to sell the whole thing as some kind of epic revenge. The materials made it clear this was a well-rehearsed bitterness he'd been nursing for a long time, even though he didn't name any specific people. And since he checked out at the scene, there was no trial, no sentencing. The public's attention quickly pivoted to the usual topics: campus safety, mental health reporting, and of course, access to firearms. Suddenly, schools and universities all over the country started taking a hard look at their lockdown drills and emergency alert systems. A few states even tightened up their background check laws to make sure mental health rulings actually got reported to the national databases this time. Virginia Tech itself rolled out new communication rules, expanded its counseling outreach programs, and beefed up the physical security in its campus buildings. The victims' families channeled their grief into honoring their loved ones, creating foundations, scholarships, and memorial events, all designed to help prevent this from happening again and support at-risk students. Norris Hall itself got a major overhaul, and some parts of it were permanently sealed off. Today, plaques and memorials spread across the campus serve as a constant reminder, listing the names of everyone who was killed. Every year, Remembrance events bring the community back together, students, alumni, and locals who are determined not to let the memory of that day just disappear. Survivors have come forward over the years, sharing their stories about the tiny, split-second decisions that ended up saving their lives, and about the incredible moments of bravery that cut through the panic. The memory of what happened on that campus continues to shape how first responders are trained to this day, counseling services, and law enforcement coordination. In the end, Sung Hui Cho checked out without leaving so much as a courtroom testimony, no cross-examination, and certainly no chance for a sentence. The whole disaster forced America to have a long, hard talk about gaps in mental health care, campus safety, and whether schools should be responsible for spotting red flags. To this day, his case is still the go-to example in debates over privacy laws, background checks, and threat assessment programs. His name is forever linked to the lives he just erased, and all the unanswered questions he left in his wake. The fallout from that morning at Virginia Tech is still with us, and it's not just in the rulebooks and procedures. It's in the stories from the people who survived it and in the memories of those who lost someone they loved. Number 10. The Oikos University shooting. The perpetrator, 1L Go, arrived on campus that day carrying a weight of resentment that had been festering for years. 1L Go, born in South Korea in 1968, was a former nursing student at Oikos University in Oakland, California. He had originally enrolled at the small private school, hoping for a fresh start in life. He landed in the United States as a grown man and basically spent years playing a real-life game of musical chairs with jobs, struggling to get his footing. He even gave the military a shot at one point, but got bounced with an administrative discharge. Folks who knew him said he wasn't exactly the life of the party, more like the quiet, withdrawn guy who made things uncomfortable. He also had a real short fuse for, well, pretty much everything that didn't go his way. Over time, that frustration just curdled into a deep sense of isolation and disappointment. In 2011, Go decided to enroll at Oikos University, a Christian vocational school that taught things like nursing and ministry. It didn't take long for him to start butting heads with classmates and teachers. He was reportedly fuming about what he saw as disrespect and was having a tough time keeping up in class. His English wasn't the best, and he got it in his head that everyone was either mocking him or just plain ignoring him. Instructors noted he seemed angry and paranoid, but he never crossed a line big enough to get him booted out on the spot. Eventually, he just ghosted his classes and dropped out of the program. In his mind, the school owed him a tuition refund, and he blamed everyone there for making him feel small. After quitting school, his life became a downward spiral of money problems and a bitterness that just ate him alive. In the months before he snapped, Go's behavior got even more unpredictable. He skipped town for a bit and torched most of his bridges. When he finally drifted back to California, it was clear he was still carrying that massive, unresolved grudge against Oikos. On April 2nd, 2012, he decided to confront the school using a method that guaranteed he'd have everyone's undivided attention. That morning, he rolled up to the campus carrying a serious piece of hardware and plenty of extra ammo. He walked into the building and went straight for the receptionist. He pointed his problem solver at her and demanded she get students into a classroom. When she couldn't just magically make that happen, he decided to skip the pleasantries and start the fireworks. Inside one of the classrooms, students were scrambling under desks or trying to bail through any available exit. Go moved from one person to the next, delivering his message at point-blank range. Witnesses later said he was disturbingly calm and systematic about it all. Some students managed to bolt from the building and warn others as a flood of calls hit the 911 switchboard. The sound of his final argument echoed through the halls, while people in other rooms barricaded themselves in, hoping to keep the chaos out. The whole awful ordeal was over in minutes, but the damage was instant and catastrophic. By the time he strolled out of there and peeled out in a car he'd stolen from a former classmate, 7 people were gone for good and 3 others were seriously hurt. The victims were a mix of students and staff, many of them immigrants just trying to build a new life. The cops kicked off a manhunt that wrapped up about an hour later when Go decided to turn himself in at a grocery store in the next town over. He casually told the employees there that he'd just popped some people and figured he should probably talk to the police. The officers took him in without any drama. In custody, Go rambled on about feeling disrespected and made fun of by everyone at Oikos University. He insisted people had mocked his accent and called him stupid, and he was convinced the school had ripped him off. The investigators found the tool he used and confirmed he bought it legally months earlier. Interviews with old classmates backed up that there was tension, though nobody ever dreamed he'd come back to settle the score like this. A lot of his complaints seemed blown way out of proportion or just plain made up, but he'd obsessed over them until they became his whole world. Go was charged with 7 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. The court proceedings hit a snag right away though, with everyone asking if he had enough marbles left to even stand trial. Psychiatrists checked him out multiple times, pointing to signs of schizophrenia and paranoia. For months, the whole process was on pause while judges tried to figure out his mental state and if he could even grasp the charges against him. In 2013, they ruled he wasn't competent and shipped him off to a state hospital for a tune-up. After nearly 2 years of treatment, doctors gave him the green light to proceed. In 2017, Go took a plea of no contest to everything, mainly to dodge a trial. The prosecutors in the court went along with the deal, and he was handed 7 consecutive life sentences without any chance of parole, plus a few more years tacked on for the people he didn't manage to kill. In court, the victims' families talked about the bright futures that were stolen, people who had come from all over the world for an education, a better life, and a safe haven from their own troubles. Some relatives were just relieved he'd be locked away forever, while others said no punishment could ever make up for what they'd lost. Oikos University never really recovered. Enrollment plummeted, and a lot of students either transferred or just left town. The building where it all went down was eventually shut for good, and memorials were set up to remember the victims. The attack put a national spotlight on campus safety, mental health, and how vulnerable smaller schools can be when they aren't prepared for these kinds of security nightmares. Go is now living out his days on the state's dime, completely cut off from the world he so fiercely blamed for all his problems. His story is a grim reminder of how a toxic cocktail of simmering rage, an untreated mind that's gone off the rails, and easy access to a tool that only creates bigger problems can explode into sudden, horrific violence. The Oikos University shooting remains one of the worst school attacks in California history, and a chilling lesson that the greatest danger can come from someone who once walked the very same halls completely unnoticed.